Hi, my name's Ade Rudd. You can tell from the accent, I'm English. I'm a strategic communications expert, also heavily involved in what I call counter-command information operations. And the basis of this is from my military background, where I served as a PSYOPs, information operations, and strategic communications operative for the British Army. During this time, I started to look at ways that adversaries approach certain problems and how they attempt to fissure, fracture, and exploit the foreign policies and domestic policies of, in particular, NATO and the European Union. And of course, one of the main adversaries, as you can see from the news at the moment, is Russian foreign policy. So I look at the way that the Russians attempt to disrupt the European Union and NATO's activities in what Russia calls its near abroad. And I look at this from a number of perspectives across five key areas of political influence operations, information operations, kinetic violence, economic and energy warfare, and then lawfare. And throughout this chat today, we're going to focus on the political influence and also the economic and energy, and how Russia ultimately goes back to its old Soviet days of attempting to split or splinter the European Union and NATO.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, Ade. Can you explain a little bit more? What does it mean, energy and economic warfare?
One of the levers of Russian influence is its use of energy. So if I think about the five sort of big powers, and you can debate whether these are the five big powers in Europe, but that's maybe for another time. If I look at Britain, Germany, Holland, France, and Italy, all of these had elections or have had elections very recently. They've had referenda recently, and all of these countries get a substantial amount of oil and gas from Russia. In return, Britain exports cars, Germany exports cars, machinery, chemicals, Holland agriculture, Italy, as no surprise, fashion, and France defence and aerospace. But in return, all of these, the trade that Russia provides is mostly in oil and gas. What Russia has done, and it did this in the Soviet Union, is it alters the price of its oil and gas depending on the political atmosphere. And what it's done, particularly in countries like Ukraine, where it turns its oil and gas off if Ukraine didn't pay its bill. It increases the price of its oil and gas to countries that it has a disagreement with, but at the same time, it will reduce the price of oil and gas to countries that it wants a favor from. And a good example of this is with Ukraine, where it increased its price of oil and gas to the Ukraine in a particularly harsh winter a couple of years ago. But at the same time, it reduced its price of oil and gas to Belarus. And a few months after this reduction in price, Belarus signed an agreement to allow Russia to put its fighter jets on its bases along the European borders. So it's an incredibly powerful lever that Russia uses. Also, Gazprom, the largest oil and gas producing company in Russia, whose one of the chairmen is Gerhard Schroeder, the former leader of East Germany, they sponsor the European Champions League. They sponsor the Continental Hockey League. So it goes just beyond the actual physical gas and oil infrastructure. It reaches into major sporting events as well. Also, Russia gets a lot of its oil and gas from its new friend, from Iran, and it has a large amount of gas and oil infrastructure. One of these is called TANAP, which is the Trans-Anatolian Pipeline. And this runs through Turkey. When Turkey shot down a Russian jet recently, you would expect Russia to act quite aggressively. What it did is it turned off this pipeline. Now, Turkey doesn't actually get any of its gas and oil through this pipeline, but what it does is it gets a stipend through almost rent for allowing this to pass through. So it wasn't getting any revenue from having this very expensive infrastructure on its land. Turkey then subsequently apologizes and launches an operation to bring back the body of the downed pilots, and the oil and gas gets turned on again. So how can we, what can we do about this? How can we control this monopoly of oil and gas? Well, one of the key areas, and you see Britain and European Union now, in the recent events of the poisoning in Salisbury, and they're talking about how can we combat Russia's revanchist foreign policy. One of the key areas is investing in gas and oil infrastructure to gain economic independence and reduce the dependence on gas and oil coming from Russia. And that's what's really going to hit Russia hard if these major countries, and I include Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania and Poland in there, if they can get economic independence or energy independence from Russia, then that will go a big way to curbing Russia's revanchist foreign policy.
Can we go back to the surface and, again, looking at European politics right now and some of the issues we're looking at in the news, through your eyes of energy and economic warfare, explain to us what's happening and what the manipulation looks like on the part of Russia for the activities that we see in terms of politics, migration, coalitions.
Across Europe, and these are global issues as well, but I think they're particularly focused within Europe because of its geographic proximity to major sources of irregular migration. And I think what we can see is, we've had referenda, we've had local elections, we've had general elections in a large number of countries across Europe, and there are a couple approaching. And one of the hot topics is migration. I think this topic of migration is intrinsically linked to the rise of populism, nationalism. I guess in the States you would call it alt-right coalitions and alt-right parties. I think in Europe we've always had this right wing that's becoming more and more right wing because of the influx of migration and because of Angela Merkel's Germany's open door policy, which she's now turned off. We've seen the rise of nationalism because of we've got a number of weak coalition governments. We've got economic hardship. We've got an influx. I mean, we have a lot of irregular migration, and tied in with that is economic migration, and also there are elements, unfortunately, nowadays of modern slavery coming into Europe. So Russia sees all of this, and it sees the rise of the right, or this increase in nationalism. So we look at Marine Le Pen in France and her Front National. We see, in Germany, the rise of their right-wing party. We see the recent Italian elections. So, fortunately for us, United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP, haven't done particularly well. And I think that, that could be down to geographics rather than political will. So what's Russia's involvement? Well, because of its monopoly and its control over oil and gas, there is very little blue-collar work available in a lot of these countries. And all of it's low paid, and a lot of it's taken up with economic migrants. Because of Schengen, people can move around Europe freely. All that you need to do is get a foothold in one country in Europe, and you can move around Europe, and you have these transferable skills where you can just move freely across the European Union. So if I go back to the sort of big picture of why does Russia do this, it's to ultimately weaken NATO and weaken the European Union. Because Russia sees NATO and the European Union as a threat because it feels uncertain. And it can't lash out militarily. So it uses economy and energy in order to, it's its weapon, along with political influence. So the combination of political influence and economic and energy, turning on the gas, turning off the gas, raising the price, decreasing the price, combined with a very pervasive and aggressive information campaign and propaganda, essentially, it enables and facilitates the rise of the right. Groups like Front National, they receive a lot of anonymous donors to fund campaigns. We've seen this in Germany. We've seen this in Italy. We've seen this in the UK with far right. I mean, really far right parties like Britain First. They receive a lot of anonymous donations. For me, those donations lead right back to the Kremlin. Russia has, in its Soviet days, it works on several levers of political influence programs. And one of these is the funding of political groups, the use of front groups, and the use of agents of influence. So this is all tied into what it does overtly. So it officially sponsors conferences. It links. It does twinning between political parties and also, twinning between towns. It assists in economic agreements, military assistance agreements, but this undercurrent of the use of front groups and agents of influence is still continuing. And what it does is it weakens the political structure and it weakens the political environment within Europe, as we can see now in Brexit. Teresa May is in my opinion, a fairly weak leader. and she has a very, very slim majority. So it puts her in a weaker position to negotiate Brexit. And you could argue that we've already started down that path, and other countries are starting to think about, is this economic union? Is this worth, or the European Union, is this worth, progressing? Is it worth still being part of? And a weak European Union, and then subsequently a weak NATO, plays into Russia's favor because it gives it what it perceives to have is freedom of action within its near abroad, and it feels less threatened. And Russia does feel threatened at the moment. It's essentially encircled.
Can you demonstrate one or two examples of exactly what it looks like when Russia funds a group, and then what the political expression of that is?
So how Russia has done this is purely by using information. It's used social media, it's used its television stations to amplify this anti-migration feeling across Italy to allow a right-wing party to have an unforecast success in the recent Italian elections.
There's a historical context to this too, isn't there? In times of difficulty, populations reaching to traditional rightist sort of ideology.
There is, and probably the most extreme example is in Germany in the 1930s, which I'm sure everybody is aware of what happened, but probably a lot of people don't know why it happened. So one of the main reasons for the rise of National Socialism in Germany in the 1930s was because of economic hardship. So Germany was still suffering from the Treaty of Versailles in 1918, where it basically said it can't have an army, it can't invest in anything. And then we had the Wall Street crash, which triggered the general strike in 1926, 1927 in the United Kingdom, and Europe was financially struggling. Germany in the 1930s was called the Weimar Republic, and it had a huge inflation was ridiculous. And there's a saying that in the 1920s we used to take our money in our pocket and our shopping home in a wheelbarrow. And in 1932, the saying was, now we take our money in a wheelbarrow and we take our shopping home in our pockets. So there was a need for change, and there was two groups that saw this need for change. One was the Communist Party on the extreme left, and one was National Socialism on the extreme right. And people started to look in both directions because they needed change, and they needed the status quo was not working. It was dysfunctional. And it just so happened, in purely physical terms, the National Socialists were stronger than the Communists because they beat them up. They destroyed their rallies and burned their printing presses. And people started to look, and they offered people what they wanted. They offered them jobs. They offered them political investment. They wanted to make Germany great again. And one of the scary things from a European perspective is I can start to see that happening again within Europe, not to such an extreme. But also, if you think about this idea of make Germany great again, there are a lot of baseball caps cutting around in America about a year ago that said, make America great again. We're going to put America first. And a lot of the same slogans and this call out to the blue collar working class. People wanted change and they got change. People want jobs. They want to be able to earn a living. They want to be able to support their families, and they want to build a national pride. And this is exactly what's happened in Italy recently. It's this restoration of Italian identity because it's been lost as part of this European quagmire that you could argue that being governed from Brussels has led to. It's led to weakened political parties across Europe, and there are others. It's just Germany in the 1930s is probably the most obvious example where people look for change. And they will dampen some of their concerns because they get jobs, they get economic investment, they get to feel national pride again. And combination of those factors with a weak government, with an influx of migration, it's a very, very easy thing to do to amplify that dissatisfaction and that almost disenfranchisement in order to build up the strength of nationalist parties.
Will you talk a little bit about middle class versus working class and what that means in politics?
So I'm an avid fan of documentaries, and I watched one recently about I think his name is Anthony Weiner, and he talks a lot about the middle class as being his core vote. There's been some recent allegations about election tampering in North Carolina and web pages being altered. And so I did a little bit of digging around this, and the person they were talking about, her key demographic for targeting for votes was the middle class. So I started to look a little bit about more around this, and is this a US phenomenon, or is it, is it a world phenomenon? And I found one major difference is traditionally in Europe, the left-wing leaning parties support the working class. The right-wing leaning parties support the middle class and the intelligentsia, etc. And I've seen that there's almost an Atlantic divide, with the majority of US politicians targeting the middle class as their key demographic. Whereas in Europe, we seem to see the rise of nationalists targeting the blue collar, targeting the working class. And it's this area of investment, politically and in capital, that is one of the major drivers of the rise of nationalism across Europe, because the working class don't feel as though they have a voice anymore. And from what I've seen, and this is a very cynical view, from what I've seen in US politics, is the working class don't really matter. And I think that's one of the big differences. If I think of big cities, and there's an easy comparison between Pittsburgh and Sheffield in England, both major steel towns, both on decline from its steel industry, because there are cheaper alternatives elsewhere, and Russia being one of these, India being another one. And they're largely ignored. There's this idea that, people should aspire to throw off the shackles of the working class and become middle class. And a lot of US politicians that I've seen in their campaigns seem to say, you should leave this working class idea behind you. You are lower middle class, or you are middle class or upper middle class, and you should always be moving up on this social scale of a class system that's anachronistic. And the extreme parties on the left and right will target the working class because, especially in Europe, they are one of the largest members of your electorate. So it's very interesting to see this difference across the Atlantic on focus of key demographics that are going to get you elected.
I would agree completely with that assessment. That was where Donald Trump was really successful in talking with and targeting the working class, where other politicians just don't even acknowledge its existence. And exactly as you put it, in only that you should aspire to something different. So my first life was in campaigning in politics. And so it's a very convenient way of not having to address working class issues, because the sentiment generally is you shouldn't be there. You should be trying to do something else. So it ignores the realities. It changes the discourse when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to minimum wage, because the idea is you shouldn't be in that position. You should be trying to do something different. And so we're talking to the real Americans who are working and are trying to get themselves out of that. So interesting, that terminology difference, and then what that leads to in a difference in mentality, and then to political organizing. So we have this trend of nationalism that we call it populism over here, that the United States is looking at, and they don't really understand what has happened, and they don't really understand where this sentiment is coming from. During the election, it was discussed in terms of these are people who haven't gone to college. They're generally, again, poor, ignorant. They don't really know what they're doing. That's why they're looking to Donald Trump. As you look closer at the voting demographic, none of that's true. It's actually the opposite. And so as we're watching this politically unfold, there is the parallel that is occurring in Europe. But because we don't think of it in terms of those frames, the United States is still baffled about what's happening here. So let's go back to that and the Russia sponsoring of minority political groups and exactly what that looks like on the political spectrum. So let's talk, for example, the Italian coalitions that are building now and German coalitions. What does the rise of nationalism look like in terms of the frame you're talking about?
If I think about this from a Russian perspective of meddling in politics, does Russia want strong nationalist governments in its European neighbours? No, it doesn't. But what it does is it seeks to foment weak governments. An increase in loud, vocal support for right-wing or all extreme left-wing parties, of which there aren't that many, it suits Russia's political agenda of creating a weak Europe. Because we have NATO and we have the European Defence Force, like the European Army. These are threats to Russian sovereignty. And if you can get European governments to waste money chasing ghosts that aren't really there to try and win elections or spend extra money on defence, it weakens their economy, which increases the need to get Russian oil and Russian gas. And what it does is it creates dissent across European partners. So there is no one European voice. And the European Union is 28 countries strong. Sorry, NATO is 28 countries strong and expanding. They have no common language.
So this is the concept that you referred to at the beginning of the interview: fissure, fracture, and exploit.
Yeah, so I came up with this concept while I was dealing with extremist terrorist organizations. How can we do something about it? And it's you identify the fissures within that group and within that organization. You turn through using information, through all of the levers that I spoke about earlier, so political, information, kinetic, economic and energy, and law. You turn those fissures into fractures, and then you exploit those fractures. And I thought, how can I extrapolate that up to the strategic level? So we can see this happening now if we look at Italy as the most recent example. So there are fissures within the government. There are, there's this idea of corruption. There's this idea of this concept of politicians being dishonest through leaking documents, through emails, through getting caught in compromising situations. So that's a fissure between the government and its people. So if you can identify those fissures and then through social manipulation, through digital manipulation, through the use of economic levers, if you can turn those fissures then into fractures, you then have this idea. You've got a governance system that can't govern its people. You've got a disenfranchised and dissatisfied population. And as we said earlier, that's when people start to look to the right-wing parties. So, and how do you exploit that? Well, in terms of Russian influence, what the ultimate exploitation of that is a weak European Union and a weak NATO, which makes Russia feel less threatened. And how I can see this is because I look at this perspective through Russian eyes. They see it purely as defensive actions. If I think in terms of they take offensive action in order to be defensive, in order to strengthen their own position and strengthen their own borders, because they feel threatened. If you take the analogy of Russia as a bear, if you poke a bear with a stick, sooner or later that bear is going to swipe out with that stick. And that's what Russia feels is happening to it. It feels as though it's being poked and it's being provoked. And it can't lash out militarily, so what it does is it seeks to weaken politically and economically the structures of NATO and the European Union.
Can you talk a little bit more about this idea of NATO chasing ghosts and Russia using information and the European Union responding with military force?
So this is part of an old Soviet technique called active measures, which seems to be a very popular phrase going around at the moment. And he uses all the levers that I spoke about earlier. And one of the best examples that we can see actually tangibly happening on the ground is in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which is what we call the Baltic states. That's not how they refer to it themselves. So what it does is it invests in information infrastructure. So an example of this would be NATO has this idea of this great Russian propaganda machine. So it says, right, we're going to invest. We're going to spend $250,000 on an independent media project in Latvia. And Russia goes, okay, yeah, I can see that happening. We're going to spend 20 million setting up a new office. You just can't compete with that. 200,000, 250,000 versus 20 million. You can't compete with that. We're talking about TV stations, radio stations, etc. So in terms of information capability in this state, in these areas, Russia is far superior. Because of the three countries, they all speak different languages. But the one thing they have in common is a Russophone population, a population that speaks Russian. So we need to set up 3 different TV stations or 3 media outlets. Russia only needs to set up 1. It's increasing its investment tenfold. So we can never compete on that stage. Russia understands that the Russian population in those 3 countries is a significant minority. For instance, in Latvia, it's 27%. Latvia refuses to recognize Russia as the official second language, so Russia exploits this and creates TV channels and radio stations and internet channels purely in Russia to make its population feel loved and make it feel wanted. What it's actually doing is increasing support for Russia by not recognizing Russian as the second language. NATO then puts the Strategic Communications Center of Excellence in Riga. Is this because Latvians are particularly good at strategic communications, or is it a statement to Russia that we're taking your threat seriously? Which, it is. The same way as in Estonia. Estonia is the NATO Centre of Excellence for cyber. Is it because Estonia is good? They are. They're incredibly good. But you could argue that they're not the best. Why is it there? Because it's a political statement. Also, up against these borders is the Western Military Division, which is vast, it's huge, it's one of Russia's best military units. It doesn't particularly threaten. It carries out exercises as every military does. It's the interpretation by NATO of these exercises, such as Zapad. They see this big exercise and they go, oh my God, this is Russia preparing to invade the Baltic states. We need to do something about this. So Russia invests in information infrastructure and carries out its normal cycle of military exercises. NATO responds by sending what's called the EFP, the Enhanced Forward Presence, which the United States is part of, also Canada, Germany, Poland, Britain, Denmark, the Dutch. And these are a semi-permanent presence. I think it's forecast to last for up to 5 years, of a battle group of around 1,500 to 2,000 people capable of war fighting placed in these 3 Baltic countries. So what Russia has now done is, by having its military forces based where they normally are, by investing in information, technology and infrastructure, it has essentially fixed 5,000 of NATO's rapid deployment forces into a country where there is no real military threat.
And then what is the relative financial investment that each side has made?
I don't know how much it costs to keep a battle group on the ground for a period of 5 years across NATO countries, but I'm sure it's not cheap. I can talk about, in terms of, if you think about an F-18 Hornet, to keep one of those in the air, and these figures are approximate, I think it's about $18,000 an hour to keep one of those in the air. And that's without it dropping any munitions or anything like that. And, the NATO air forces are flying around protecting the Baltic airspace. So we're spending a vast amount of NATO money, and the NATO target's 2% of GDP for each country. We're spending a vast amount of this GDP just keeping things in the air, as well as keeping a military presence on the ground. And it's a drain on resources. It's a drain on resources that we can't spend elsewhere, such as the Western Balkans, which is now where everybody perceives that Russia has turned its influence to, because the Serbs are Slavs, the Serbs feel encircled by NATO, with Macedonia, Montenegro, Greece all potentially joining NATO. And the one thing I've learned is, over the past sort of 10 years that I've been doing this, is never look where Russia's pointing. And we can see that probably one of the best examples of this is the annexation of the Crimea. So while the world was looking at the closing ceremony of the Sochi Winter Olympics and going, what a fantastic Olympics it was, what a wonderful showpiece of, how Russia can hold this amazing event, given that Russia has sanctions imposed on it, but it's still managed to pull this thing together. So while Vladimir Putin, is like handing over the Olympic baton to the next country to take it on, Russian military officers are on the streets of the Crimea, whilst the world is looking in a different place. Everybody now is looking at the Western Balkans, thinking Russia's going to expand here because it's expanding into Sputnik Serbia, the Serbian language Sputnik arm, the Kremlin TV network. And so everybody's looking elsewhere. We've still got this idea, we've still got this paranoia that Russia's going to invade the Baltic states. We're now starting to look down into the Balkans, and we're looking in the wrong place. Where we should be looking is a little bit further east, into countries that people have probably never heard of, such as Transnistria, which is an independent or semi-autonomous state, which is part of Moldova, which sits along the Ukrainian and Romanian border. Why is Romania relevant? Well, the US has a major military base there, and Georgia, the US has a military base there. And that's a small victory. And that's all Russia can do at the moment, is win these small victories whilst draining NATO's resources, as it looks where Russia is pointing. And it could invade Transnistria tomorrow. It doesn't need to, but it could. And it knows that because neither Romania, Moldova, or Transnistria are NATO members, then it will not be an Article 5 act of war. So it can get away with it, as it did with Ukraine, as it did with Southern Ossetia, as it did in Ingushetia, as it's done in Chechnya.
When we're talking about sort of the sleight of hand and don't look where Russia is pointing. So we talked about a number of things. To sort of pull everything together, how should we be looking at European politics? And also there's this sort of looming question about what social media manipulation looks like and whether or not that should be a concern. How would you address that?
Social media is an incredibly important means of dissemination. And I see it purely as a means of dissemination. The planning and the tactics and the strategy behind it is strategic communications. It's the same way as using a billboard. It's the same way as buying radio time, TV time. It's a means of dissemination. But what it does offer is it offers a vast and incredibly rapid means of getting a message out there. Because the attention span of human beings is so short nowadays because of the proliferation and the gamut of information that's out there, we tend to look at things in terms of sound bites or, very, very, or tweets, a number of characters. And that's about the length of our attention span. So we tend not to look beyond what we see. What's incredibly important is creating a credible source for your information. If somebody is retweeting things and you believe you have this idea of this perception that they are a credible source, then you kind of take that at face value. It's very easy to shift public opinion just through sheer weight of information. If you get 100 tweets saying this is a good thing and 10 saying this is a bad thing, it's a very easy decision to make in the human brain that's pressed for time and under so much pressure that we go, well, 100 people have said this, 10 people have said that, therefore those 100 must be right. And we don't check it, which is why yellow journalism, fake news, disinformation, propaganda is so easily spread. As Lenin called them, the world is full of useful idiots who will just retweet and just share all this information without actually checking the facts. So if you can get something that hits your target demographic and it hits them at a level that's important to them. And across Europe, it's migration at the moment. So if you can amplify just by sheer weight of numbers, the amount of anti-migrant messages that are out there, it creates a groundswell. And people who would normally be liberal or would normally think in terms of open-mindedness, they see this groundswell of popular opinion against migration. It starts to make them think, well, am I the only one who thinks this is a good thing? They bring in new skill sets, diversity, cultural depth. No, they're stealing our jobs. They're carrying out sexual assaults. They're creating trouble. They're a drain on our economy. They're a drain on our hospitals. And you start going against the flow. And people tend not to like, psychologically, people tend not to like to go against the flow. It's very easy to dismiss people as conspiracy theorists. I've seen it recently where a very, very capable, with a strong history of academic excellence was dismissed on a forum because this person had also posted blogs on a 9/11 truther site. So therefore, you are expected to make the connection that because this person posted it on the 9/11 truther site, everything else they say is conspirational and isn't grounded in fact. And if you can discredit somebody and undermine their credibility very quickly, just by sheer weight of numbers, I think within 4 hours of the anti-migration party in Italy putting forward their manifesto, 15,000 tweets within about 4 hours had sent their manifesto all over or drawn their attention to this anti-migration manifesto. So it's an incredibly powerful means of dissemination. But at its heart, behind every computer, behind every tablet, behind every smartphone, is a human being. And those are the people that we need to target. We need to target the individual and the human being by really understanding what makes them tick and using those levers to counter this deliberate disinformation and hoax that's out there. I feel slightly glib quoting Russia Today by saying we just need to question more, check your facts, because this is a deliberate process. This is propaganda. This is back to Goebbels, which is probably not a comfortable thing for many people to hear. But if you say the lie enough times, it becomes true. And that's the really, really worrying part. And we need to look beyond that. And we need to look at the reasons why this is happening, why Russia is doing this, and what we can realistically do to prevent this. Because we can't defeat them using information because of their tactics that have been developed over a long period of time. We could defeat them militarily, but nobody wants that. The way to defeat Russia in terms of its revanchist foreign policy is to A, understand that it feels threatened and it feels surrounded, and B, its main lever is energy. If we invest in energy infrastructure across Europe, we decrease our dependence on Russian gas and oil, and therefore we weaken Russia's aggressive and pervasive information narrative across the whole spectrum.
Thank you. That was really informative. And so far, I think that is above and beyond the best explanation I've heard for what the actual social media threat looks like. So if you're talking about personal credibility, if you are talking about compromising political leadership, or if you're talking about strategic threats, the idea that misinformation can be used to manipulate and actually even mobilize NATO. This is really powerful. And thank you very much for your time. And are there any other closing statements that you have?
No, just like to say thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to chatting again in the future. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Ade.